I signed the check for my son-in-law's car the same morning. He told his wife I was an embarrassment to the family. I didn't know that yet. I found out later, the way I found out most things in those years quietly, after the damage was already done. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I live alone in a house that is too big and too quiet. And for 11 years I paid for a life that was never mine. I paid for the mortgage on a house in Scottsdale where my daughter and her husband slept in a bed that cost more than my first car. I paid for private school tuition for my grandson, a serious little boy named Oliver who collected rocks and asked questions about everything. I paid the insurance on 3 vehicles, 2 of which I had never once ridden in. I paid for vacations I was not invited on. I paid for a kitchen renovation that my daughter sent me photos of, with captions like, "Finally feels like us," without any acknowledgement that I had written the check 2 weeks before. I did not do these things because I was weak. I want to be clear about that. I did them because my daughter was my only child, and her mother, my Margaret, died when my daughter was 19 years old. And I had made a promise at a graveside in Phoenix that I would never let our girl fall. I kept that promise longer than was good for either of us. My daughter's name is Renee. She was a bright child, stubborn and funny, with her mother's eyes and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. I raised her the best I knew how, working long hours as a civil engineer, making sure the bills were paid, showing up to every school play and every soccer game even when I was exhausted down to my bones. She grew into a beautiful young woman, and I was proud of her in the way that only fathers understand, that specific, wordless pride that sits in your chest and doesn't need to be spoken because it is simply always there. Then she married Derek. Derek Calloway came from a family in Chandler that had a great deal of confidence and very little else. His father, Raymond, had once owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses that had gone under in 2009. His mother, Patricia, spoke about their membership at a country club they had stopped being able to afford in 2014 as though it were a current fact. They dressed well. They hosted dinners with cloth napkins and 3 kinds of wine. They referred to people they considered beneath them with a particular smile, polite on the surface, dismissive underneath, and they deployed that smile on me from the very first evening Renee brought me to meet them. I was wearing a flannel shirt. I had driven 2 hours from Tucson, where I had lived for 30 years. In my truck, a 2009 F-150, a little banged up but reliable. Raymond Calloway shook my hand and then looked at the truck in the driveway for just a moment too long. Patricia offered me a glass of wine I didn't particularly want and asked me, with that smile, what it was I did for work. I told her I was retired. She nodded as if that confirmed something. What I did not tell her, because she had not asked in a way that made me want to answer, was that I had spent 31 years as a senior civil engineer and then a project director for one of the largest infrastructure firms in the Southwest, that I had retired at 58, that the house in Tucson was paid off, that I had a brokerage account and a pension and investments that I managed carefully and that had grown, over many patient years, into something that would have rearranged Patricia Calloway's expression considerably. I was not a dishonest man. I simply did not volunteer information to people who had already decided who I was. Renee knew I was comfortable. She knew I helped her and Derek financially. But I had never sat my daughter down and shown her the full picture, because money had always made her uncomfortable, or rather, the idea of owing it had. Every time I wrote a check, she thanked me quickly and changed the subject. I told myself this was humility. I understand now that it was something else. The first few years of their marriage, I was invited to holidays and the occasional birthday. Derek was polite to me in the way that a man is polite to someone he has decided is not worth the effort of actual kindness. He called me by my first name, Wallace, with a slight emphasis that I could never quite put my finger on. His parents came to Christmas, and I came to Christmas, and we sat at the same table and ate the same food. And I was always seated at the far end near the kitchen, and Raymond always held court at the head. I noticed. I said nothing. Oliver was born in 2017, and for a while things softened. There is something about a grandchild that makes the difficult parts of a family feel temporary, like weather that will eventually pass. I drove up to Scottsdale every few weeks. I brought Oliver books and small things. I had found an unusual piece of quartz, a compass, a wooden puzzle I had made myself in my shop in Tucson. He was a quiet, watchful child, and he reminded me so much of Margaret that sometimes I had to step outside and breathe for a moment. But by the time Oliver was 4, the invitations became less frequent. When I called Renee, the conversations grew shorter. There was always something happening. Derek's work, the school, the renovation, a trip they were planning. I would ask if I could come up that weekend and she would say, "Let me check with Derek." And then 2 days later send a text that said, "This weekend's actually pretty crazy. Maybe next month?" I kept paying the bills. I told myself that this was a season, that young families were busy, that it would open up again. In October of 2023, Renee called me on a Tuesday evening. Her voice was bright in the way that it gets when she wants something, and is working up to it carefully. She told me that Derek's parents were coming to stay for a week, that it was Raymond's birthday, that they were planning a big family dinner, something special, and she wanted me to come. I felt something loosen in my chest. I said I would be there. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, taking the long way through the desert because I have always loved that drive, the saguaros standing in the late light, the sky going orange and red behind the mountains. I stopped and got gas and a cup of coffee and sat for a few minutes just watching the evening come in. I was happy. I want to remember that clearly. I was genuinely happy driving to my daughter's house that evening. I arrived at 6. The driveway was full of cars. Raymond's Lincoln, Patricia's white SUV, an unfamiliar BMW that I later learned belonged to Derek's younger brother, Spencer, who had driven in from Tempe. I parked on the street and walked up to the door with a birthday card for Raymond that contained a check, because I did not know what else to give a man like that, and a bouquet of flowers for Renee. Because Margaret had always said, "Flowers made a house feel like someone thought about it." Renee opened the door. She was dressed beautifully, her hair up, and she glanced at the flowers and took them with a quick kiss on my cheek and said, come in, everyone's in the living room." I came in. The living room was arranged around Raymond, who sat in the largest chair with a glass of red wine. Patricia was on the sofa beside Spencer's wife, whose name I would never successfully remember. Derek stood near the fireplace. They all looked at me in the way of people who have been talking and have now been interrupted. Derek said, "Wallace, glad you made it," and then immediately turned back to Raymond and continued whatever he had been saying. I found a chair near the window. I set my jacket over the arm. Renee brought me a glass of water, which was what I had asked for, and then went to the kitchen. Patricia smiled at me, that same smile from 9 years ago. Unchanged. Preserved perfectly. Raymond lifted his wine in a vague gesture that might have been acknowledgement. The dinner was long. The table seated 8, and I was at the far end, between Spencer's wife and an empty chair that no one sat in. The food was good. Renee had always been an excellent cook, like her mother, but the conversation flowed around me rather than toward me. Raymond told a story about a golf trip to Scotland. Spencer talked about a property he was looking at in Sedona. Derek talked about his firm's new account, a commercial development in North Phoenix, and the numbers he threw out were large and said loudly. I ate my food and listened and did not say much, because there did not seem to be space for what I might have said. After dinner, Raymond asked Derek to open another bottle from the wine rack. Renee was clearing plates. I stood up to help her. The way I always had, I had done dishes after every meal in our house when she was growing up, because Margaret said no one should cook, and then also clean, and I picked up 3 plates and carried them toward the kitchen. The stairs to the upper level were at the edge of the dining room, separated from the kitchen by a half wall. I passed them to get to the kitchen. I was carrying the plates in both hands. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Renee came around the corner quickly, not looking, and she was talking to Derek about something, and she was moving with that busy, pressured energy she gets when she is trying to manage too many things at once. And she turned the corner, and her shoulder hit mine, and the plates went sideways, and I put my hand out to catch them, and my foot went off the edge of the single step down from the dining room to the hall, and I fell. I am 63, and I am not frail. But I fell hard. I went down on my left side, the plates shattering around me, my shoulder hitting the floor, my head hitting the corner of the half wall. I lay there for a moment with my ears ringing. And then I heard it. A sharp sound, not a gasp. Not the beginning of a question asking if I was all right. Laughter. Patricia's particular high-pitched note of amusement, quickly covered. Raymond's low exhale that meant he found something funny but would not commit to laughing out loud. Spencer's wife saying something under her breath. And Derek saying, clearly enough for me to hear from the floor, "Oh, Wallace, always so careful." More laughter. I lay on the floor of my daughter's hallway with broken plates around me and blood starting to come from a cut on my temple. And I listened to my son-in-law make a joke at my expense, and I listened to his family laugh, and I listened for my daughter's voice telling them to stop. I did not hear it. What I heard was Renee saying quickly and quietly, "Dad, are you okay?" And then, before I could answer, the sound of her turning back toward the kitchen, toward the business of the evening, toward the people whose opinion of her required management. I got myself up. It took a moment. My shoulder hurt and my head was bleeding slightly, not seriously, just the way head cuts do, more dramatically than they mean. I went to the bathroom and cleaned it up with a wet cloth and stood for a while looking at myself in the mirror. I am a man who has stood in the wind on job sites in August heat, who has worked through the deaths of both parents and a wife and a business partner and has kept showing up. I know what I am. I have never been a man who requires much from the world in the way of acknowledgement. But I stood in that bathroom for a long time. When I came out, Raymond was telling another story. No one asked about my head. Derek glanced at me once and nodded in a way that I suppose was meant to be acknowledgement. I sat back in my chair by the window. I stayed for 40 minutes. Because leaving immediately felt like something, and I was not ready to decide what to do with what I felt yet. Then I said goodnight, thanked Renee for dinner, shook Raymond's hand, and drove to the Holiday Inn Express 3 miles down the road where I had already made a reservation because I had known from experience that I would not be offered the guest room. I sat in that hotel room with an ice pack against my temple, and I was very quiet inside. I am going to tell you what I decided that night. But first I need to tell you what I knew that no one else in that house knew. For 31 years I worked in engineering and infrastructure development. In the last 12 years of my career I was a project director and then a regional VP, and I was good at my job, very good, and I was compensated accordingly. I was not flashy with it, because Margaret and I had grown up without much and we never forgot what that felt like. We lived in the same house in Tucson we had bought in 1991. I drove practical vehicles. I did not own a boat or a vacation property or a wardrobe that required a separate closet. When Margaret died, I put a substantial amount of energy into making sure that our daughter would never struggle. And I did it quietly, because she had enough grief, without also feeling like a financial obligation. Over 11 years of supporting Renee and Derek's household in various ways, I had given them somewhere between $460,000 and $490,000. I kept careful records. Not because I expected anything back, I did not, but because I am an organized person and I had always tracked my expenses the way my father taught me. What Renee and Derek did not know, what the Callaways did not know, was that the money I had given them over 11 years was, relative to what I had, a modest portion. I had managed my assets carefully for many years. I had a financial advisor in Tucson named Jim Beckett, who was also a friend. And Jim had helped me build a picture over the decades that was considerably larger than my flannel shirts and my F-150 suggested. I do not say this to brag. I say it because it is the only way the rest of this story makes sense. I called Jim from the hotel room at 9:30 that evening. He picked up on the third ring, which is the kind of friend he is. I told him what had happened. Not dramatically. I am not a dramatic person. Just plainly, the way I would describe a site problem to a project team. The facts in order. Jim listened without interrupting. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're sure?" I looked at the ice pack in my hand. I thought about the sound of laughter while I was bleeding on the floor. "Yes," I said. The following Monday, I drove back to Tucson and spent 2 days with Jim and with my attorney, a woman named Carol Delaney who has handled my affairs for 15 years and who is one of the sharpest people I have ever known. We restructured several things. We updated documents. We made a set of decisions that were irrevocable once made. And I made them with full clarity and no anger. Because anger passes but choices stay. And I wanted my choices to outlast whatever I was feeling. Then I did something I had never done. I hired a financial investigator, a man named Philip, who came recommended by Carol, and I asked him to look into Derek's business affairs. I want to be honest with you. I did not expect to find anything. I did it because I wanted to be certain that what I was about to do would not harm someone who did not deserve it, and the only way to be certain was to look. Philip came back to me in 3 weeks with a report that was 42 pages long. Derek Calloway, it turned out, had been running his small development firm with a fairly creative interpretation of where client funds should go. 3 separate investor accounts showed patterns that Philip described, carefully, as highly irregular. There was a business loan, co-signed by a man named Terry Voigt, that Derek had used for a purpose entirely different from the one stated in the loan agreement. There were invoices for contractors who, when Philip checked, had no record of the work described. I read the report twice. Then I called Carol. She said, "Wallace, this is beyond restructuring documents. You need to decide how far you want to take this." I told her I wanted to take it to the right people and then step back. I did not want to be the one holding the sword. I just wanted to make sure the right people were looking. Carol made 2 calls. I will not say to whom, because that is not my information to share. But the right people started looking. In the meantime, I made 1 more call. To Renee. She answered on the 2nd ring, a little wary in her voice, the way she had been since the dinner, as if she knew something was coming and was bracing for a conversation she didn't want to have. I asked her how she was. She said fine. Busy. I asked how Oliver was. She said great. He'd lost a tooth. She'd send a photo. Then I told her, calmly and without drama, that I would be ending my financial contributions to the household at the end of the month. The mortgage assistance, the insurance, the school tuition, the car payments on the 2 vehicles, I had been covering all of it. I told her I was giving her 60 days notice because I was not a cruel person and I wanted her to have time to make arrangements, and I told her I was doing this because I had thought carefully about what it meant to love someone and realized that what I had been doing was not helping her, it was keeping both of us from seeing things clearly. I did not mention the dinner. I did not mention the laughter or the ice pack or the cut on my temple. I mentioned none of it, because I did not want her to think this was emotional. It was not emotional. It was a decision. Renee was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if this was about the dinner, and I said no. This was about 11 years. And she said, "Dad, that's not fair." And I said, "I know it feels that way." And she said Derek would call me, and I said that was fine. Derek called me that evening. His voice was the controlled voice of a man who is not used to negotiating from a weak position and has found himself there unexpectedly. He was reasonable and then less reasonable, and then he said some things that I will not repeat because they were said in desperation, and desperation makes people ugly, and I do not wish to hold that against him more than necessary. I let him talk. When he was finished, I said I hoped things worked out for him, and I said goodbye. 2 things happened in the following months that I had not anticipated, though perhaps I should have. The first was Raymond Calloway calling me. He had found my number through Derek, and he called on a Wednesday evening with a very different voice than the one he used at dinner parties, quieter, stripped of its performance. He told me that Derek had been counting on my financial support, and that the family was in a difficult position, and asked if there was something we could discuss. I asked him how long he had known the mortgage on Renee's house was being paid by a man he had seated at the end of the table. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I see." I said, "I hope you do. Good night, Raymond." The second thing was Oliver. Oliver was 6 by then, and Renee had been keeping him from me in the way that frightened, cornered people keep the people they love from the people they're in conflict with, not out of malice, I believed, but out of confusion, because when you are inside a difficult situation, you make decisions from inside it and cannot see the shape of it from outside. But Oliver called me from Renee's phone one afternoon while she was, I later learned, in the shower. He told me he had found a really good rock, He described it in considerable detail, white with orange streaks, maybe quartz, maybe something else. He wasn't sure. He asked if he could bring it to show me. I told him of course he could. He said, "Grandpa, are you mad at us?" I thought about how to answer honestly to a 6-year-old. I said, "I'm not mad at you. Not even a little bit. Not even at all." He said, "Okay." Satisfied. The way children are when they get the specific piece of information they needed. I said I would see him soon, and I meant it. And I intended to fight for that in every legal way available to me if I had to. The investigation Philip initiated took 7 months to develop into something official. I will not describe the details, because some of it is still in process, and some of it is not mine to describe. What I can tell you is that Derek's highly irregular finances became the subject of serious attention. That Terry Voigt, the co-signer on the problematic loan, filed a civil complaint, and that the story Derek Calloway had told about himself began coming apart in ways that no one, including his parents, could manage or spin. The house in Scottsdale went on the market in the spring. Renee called me in April. This time her voice was different. Not bright in the working up to something way and not wary in the bracing way. Just her voice, the real one. The one I had known since she learned to talk. She said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "Okay." She came to Tucson. She sat in my kitchen, in the chair her mother used to sit in. And she cried for a long time, and I let her. Because that is what you do when the person you love is finally feeling the thing they needed to feel. I made coffee. I did not say I told you so because I never had and never would. I did not perform forgiveness because the truth is I had never stopped loving her for a single day. Not through any of it. And love that hasn't stopped does not need to perform its return. She asked me why I hadn't said more, hadn't warned her, hadn't pushed harder. I told her that I had tried, gently, early on, and she had not been ready to hear it, and I had loved her enough not to push. She said, "I heard you laugh." She didn't ask it, she said it, and I understood she meant that night, the dinner, the floor. I didn't laugh. I said, "I was the one on the floor." She looked at me for a long time. "I know," she said. "I know you weren't. I just needed to say that I heard them, and I didn't stop it, and I'm sorry." I told her I knew she was sorry. I told her that was enough. Oliver is living with Renee now in a rental near my old neighborhood in Tucson. He brought me the rock. It was quartz, orange-veined. A good specimen, and I put it on the shelf in my shop next to the ones I have collected over 63 years. He comes over on Saturdays and we work on things in the shop together, and he asks questions about everything, and I answer all of them honestly, because that is what grandchildren deserve. Renee is working. She is a good, intelligent woman who spent too many years managing a life she couldn't see the foundation of, and now she is building one she can see entirely, and I am watching her with the same pride. I always had that specific, wordless kind that lives in the chest and doesn't need to be spoken. Raymond and Patricia Calloway have not contacted me again. I wish them nothing bad. I wish them, genuinely, whatever clarity they are able to find. I think about Margaret sometimes, the promise I made. I have decided that I kept it, not the way I thought I would, not without cost, but I kept it. Our girl did not fall. She landed hard, but she is standing now, and the ground under her feet is real this time. That is all a father can ever actually do. Make sure the ground is real. I know that now. I should have known it earlier, but I was a slow learner on this particular subject, and I have made my peace with that, and most mornings I wake up in my quiet house in Tucson, and I drink my coffee on the porch, and I watch the light come up over the desert, and I think, this is enough. This is more than enough.